To understand why the code is not updating, we can refer back to our lifecycle diagram. In the Android lifecycle, when you navigate away from an activity, onPause and onStop are called. When you come back, onStart and onResume are called. OnCreate is never called unless you rotate the activity or reopen the activity after being closed. So one option for loading up our preferences would be to read from shared preferences in the onResume or onStart callback. But there's a better way. The shared preferences object allows you to register an object that implements a onSharedPreferenceChange listener. This object then gets called whenever a value in the shared preferences file changes. In this way, you can actually be triggered to update the UI if and only if a preference has actually changed. Setting this up will take 4 steps. First, we determine the activity that needs to get called when the preference is changed. In this case, that's going to be visualizer activity. This is because visualizer activity is the one whose UI needs to change. Second, we're going to need visualizer activity to implement a onSharedPreferenceChange listener. This will then require that visualizer activity implement a method called onSharedPreferenceChange, which will be triggered whenever a preference is changed. Third, you need to link the onSharedPreferenceChange listener with the shared preference object it should be listening to. You could do this using register onSharedPreferenceChange listener. And then fourth, you also need to unregister the listener when the activity is shut down. You can do this using the unregister onSharedPreferenceChange listener. Phew, that was a mouthful. Okay, let's do this. I'll start in visualizer activity by implementing the onSharedPreferenceChange listener. This is red now because I actually have to override onSharedPreferenceChange. So I will go ahead and do that. Here, I'm going to check what preference changed, and then I'm going to update my visualizer view accordingly. This is a lot like what I'm doing in the current onCreate method. Note that up here, I'm passed both a reference to shared preferences and the key of the preference that was changed. So I don't actually need to use the preference manager to get a reference to shared preferences because I already have one. This also makes taking shared preferences and getting the Boolean from it pretty easy. Now that I've made visualizer activity implement onSharedPreferenceChange, I'm going to register the listener. I'll want to do this in onCreate when the activity is created. So I'm going to do it in the setUpSharedPreferences method. I'm going to take the shared preferences object and call register onSharedPreferenceChange listener, passing in this. Remember, visualizer activity implements shared preferences onSharedPreferenceChange listener, which is why I can pass in this. Now that I've registered the listener, I also have to unregister the listener. And I'll do that in onCreate's corresponding onDestroy method. So I'm going to override onDestroy, and in that method, I'm going to just get my preference manager, and I'm going to get the default shared preferences, and I'm going to unregister the onSharedPreferenceChange listener. Great, let's run the app and see what happens. And it updated.